Hello, thank you very much for joining me. For those of you who are in this webinar here, my name is Albert Lopez Ramos. I am the Assistant Director of Admissions at the Drucker School of Management, located here in sunny California in Los Angeles. And I've been with the school for 6 years now. And I've been involved heavily with the admission process as well as the recruiting process, recruiting some of our top students and whatnot. And today we're going to talk about whether or not having a high GMAT score and a GPA and a bunch of extracurriculars is a perfect formula for acceptance. Um, there's really an assumption among students and in the marketplace in general that a high GPA and a high GMAT score is the perfect formula. Yeah, the perfect recipe for admission. That such formula will always warrant and guarantee admission. Um, and yet there are others other students with a low GPA and a high GMAT, or vice versa, who believe that there's a certain formulaic balance between GPA and GMAT that assures admission. So is it a perfect formula for acceptance? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is no, or at least not necessarily. Now, give me 1 second here. Here we go. To an extent, admission really depends on the schools and programs that you're applying to. But for the most part, for the majority of schools, including selective schools, GPA and GRE scores are really secondary considerations. I know for some students this may be really hard to believe, but it is true. I will explain why later in this presentation. Instead, other factors in the application, such as work experience and behavioral attributes, often come to the forefront of the review process. And in this regard, the personal statement, the resume, and the admission interview play a much more prominent role, believe it or not. Admission, to a large extent, in my experience, often centers on the maturity and marketability, i.e. the employability of the applicant. We want future students to be able to articulate clear, focused, and realistic future goals, and demonstrate how their past experiences will help them achieve such goals. We also want our students to have had a logical career trajectory and a mature future blueprint in mind. Our goal as a school, in the end, is to help students achieve their professional goals and succeed along with their organizations. That is the business of management schools, to see that our student customers obtain the proper skills and training they need, and for our business partners to obtain the necessary human capital they need. Behavioral-wise, we want them to be passionate and driven to succeed, and we want to be able to determine the factors, experiences, and/or situational contexts that inspire and fuel such qualities. We also want our future students to be a fit for our school, and for the school to be a fit for the students' future goals. Specifically, we want to make sure the goals of our applicants can be achieved with the type of management education we provide. Along the same vein, we want our students to be highly interested and motivated to attend our school. If there is fit, in other words, alignment, there's a greater likelihood that the student will be content with his or her academic experience, find a job, and succeed in his or her organization. Greater likelihood he or she will also give back to the school as an alumni. And we often gauge these qualities not through the GPA and GMAT, for they are just numeric measures, but via the personal statement, the resume, and the admission interview, as I mentioned earlier. Of course, having a high GPA and GMAT score certainly adds value to the application and increases the chances of admission. But these measures, in and of themselves, do not guarantee or warrant admission. Believe me, just this admission cycle, our school denied 2 applicants with 720 GMATs coupled with 3.4 GPAs, which we would have loved to have, but they lack the personal qualities and career attributes I just described. Yet even though I convey this message over and over to prospective students, they cannot seem to accept the fact that GPA and GMAT scores do not play the most important role at times. They still demand for suggestions on what constitutes a comparative GPA or GMAT score. To satiate such need, let's quickly address what constitutes, in general, a competitive GMAT score for most programs. You will find that the answer largely depends on the type of school and program you apply to. In general, admission standards for full-time and part-time programs differ. But all things equal, obtaining a GMAT score of 620 or above is a safe bet when applying to full-time programs of medium to high selectivity. Likewise, a score of 580 should suffice for admissions into part-time programs. Of course, the more competitive the program is, the higher the GMAT score must be. Keep in mind that many schools also award fellowships and scholarships based on the merit of your GMAT score. So even if the uncertainty of admission is not an issue for you, it is worthwhile to study and obtain as high of a GMAT score as possible. The higher your GMAT score, the greater likelihood you will receive a competitive financial aid offer. The same framework applies when it comes to the GPA. GPA standards will differ depending on whether you apply to a full-time or part-time program, and whether you apply to a highly selective school or not. Keep in mind, however, that degree major and type does play a role when evaluating a GPA. Majority of schools only consider and evaluate undergraduate GPAs. Graduate GPA plays a secondary role. And a 3.0 GPA in chemical engineering may not be viewed as the same as a 3.0 GPA in sociology or political science, or in any of the humanities. Now, I don't mean to demean these fields. I myself have a degree in political science, but business schools have an affinity towards quantitative majors as they're better apt to excel in quantitative courses. All in all, achieving a 3.4 GPA, regardless of major, is a good grade point average to secure admissions to most business programs, whereas a 3.1 GPA or above will suffice for admissions to most part-time programs. And like high GMAT scores, a high GPA can afford you the opportunity to obtain financial aid in the form of fellowships or scholarships, so make sure to do well if in fact you're still in school. Involvement in organizations outside of school and work also add value to your application, especially if post-baccalaureate work experience is minimal. Extracurricular activities will definitely help offset such weaknesses. More so if you can demonstrate how your involvement in one or two particular organizations will tie into achieving your professional goals. As with work experience, try to show how the selection of organizations you decide to work with was by design and with purpose in mind. Demonstrate how they relate to the achievement of your social and professional goals. No, I have many students ask me whether the quantity of organization one is involved with matter. The answer is no. Do not assume that the more organizations you are involved with, the better your application will be perceived. Instead, involve yourself with one or two meaningful organizations and be an actual productive contributor rather than being a passive member in many organizations. Make sure to list and highlight all of your achievements as well. Extracurricular activities also provide admission committees a window to your personal interests outside of work and school. It allows us to get to know more about you as it relates to interests and social issues that may be dear to you. So being an active participant in extracurriculars is definitely a plus. Now, returning to my previous discussion, I mentioned that a high GPA and GMAT score is no guarantee of admission. Instead, other factors such as work experience, marketability, and maturity often play a more prominent role. So the question is, why aren't they a perfect formula? One of the reasons for that is the rankings. For many business schools, getting highly ranked is a priority. It signals quality and prestige, and it also provides visibility and credibility in the marketplace. This slide shows some of the more well-known different rankings in the United States. However, if we take the most popular ranking, the U.S. News and World Report ranking, you will notice that GPA and GMAT scores and extracurricular activities are not weighted as heavily as other factors. Rather, you will notice that a big part of getting ranked has to do with the school's quality assessment as determined by peer schools and corporate recruiters, and the school's job placement success. Together, they account for 75% of the school's rank. Therefore, if we assume the majority of schools have an interest or a priority in being highly ranked, it is fair to assume they are more likely to admit students with significant work experience or the appropriate behavioral traits that will push them to obtain high-paying jobs immediately following graduation. Statistically speaking, a student's placement success is highly correlated to the amount of previous work experience and effort placed in finding employment. Therefore, many business schools admit students not on account of their GPAs and GMAT scores alone, but along with the potential to gain meaningful employment after graduation. As I mentioned earlier, admission committees want to admit mature and marketable students, students who can articulate clear, focused, and achievable goals, and whose previous work experience will aid them in doing so. And a student's potential to achieve future placement success can only be discerned from the personal statement, from the applicant's admission interview, and from the resume, not necessarily from the GPA or GMAT score. The latter measures are important, of course, and certainly add value to the application, but they are definitely not the sole basis for admission, especially in schools where ranking may be a priority. So in general, the placeability, i.e. the marketability of a student, plays more of a role in a school being highly ranked than does GPA or GMAT scores. Thus, it is extremely important that you write an effective and coherent personal statement. Some schools have a specific prompt they want you to address, others have a series of prompts, and yet others are open-ended essays. Whatever the case may be, make sure to take your time to introspect and actually address the questions as creatively as possible. Okay? Ensure that your content is compelling and supported with vivid examples, Ensure your voice and style is confident, poised, and professional. Make sure your organization is elegantly constructed, and make sure your syntax is sophisticated and free of unnecessary errors. Okay? Admission committees often want to see what lessons you've learned through your work experiences and how these lessons will contribute to the classroom conversation. You also want to reference school specifics and briefly mention the reasons you're applying to such particular school. Express how you are a fit for the school and vice versa. Okay. With respect to the admission interview, do not take the interview lightly. It is your opportunity to shine. Do not ask superfluous questions. Do not ask questions just to ask. Don't ask questions specifically that can be answered by going to the website. You want to try to produce a meaningful conversation and dialogue. Okay? When it comes to the admission interview, also try to be yourself. Consider it a two-way exchange, but do not run or set the tone of the interview. And be an active listener and do your research. We are ultimately gauging your actual level of interest in our school, as well as fit, marketability, and maturity that will allow you to attain your goals. Okay? And remember to be always courteous and polite, and exude confidence and have a positive, amicable attitude. Such characteristics will go a long way. Okay? Now, do not forget about references. They play a role in balancing any weaknesses in your application, like your GPA. Okay. Make sure references can elaborate on particular strengths, using concrete examples and whatnot. If your references actually manage to do this, it will lend credibility to the actual relationship you have established with your reference. And avoid generic reference letters. Try to get people to write letters of reference that can really speak in particular about your strengths. And you could always get a reference letter from a friend or a school or an alumni. It's definitely a plus. Okay. Now, one question I received a couple of times this admission cycle is whether it makes an impact if a CEO or a high-level executive writes one of your reference letters. The answer is no, or at least not necessarily. Having a reference letter from an executive is impressive, but it can also be detrimental if it's too generic and does not carry substance. Instead, I would recommend obtaining a reference letter from a more peer professional colleague that can really elaborate and express your strengths as a future student. Lastly, it also helps if you can have a friend of the school or even an alumni write a letter of reference for you, like I mentioned earlier. Admission committees love to know when future students are somehow involved or connected with a school of a friend or an alumni. Okay. Now, the other question I get is whether or not business schools actually use a formula or some kind of algorithm in their admission process. The answer is some do, others don't. If I had to make an educated guess, I would say that many business schools actually do not use fancy formulas. Some may make preliminary use of filters, but the admission selection process is too complex to delegate such additions to an impartial formula. For those of you with the assumption that schools do use a fancy formula or some sort of system and are trying to predict their outcomes or understand their inner workings, keep in mind that formulas are subject to change as the admission cycle transpires and nor to meet certain admission goals. Okay? But like I mentioned, the majority of schools, including those highly ranked, do not use such mechanisms. If you guys do know one, please give me a call or send one over. Okay? Next slide here. Instead of formulas, there's only suggestions and general rules. The first is that, in general, yes, the GMAT carries a bit more weight than the GPA, since it is the most recent measure of a student's potential to succeed. Okay? Another rule of thumb is to use average and measures and percentiles as a compass, so you can find yourself as to how competitive you will be as an applicant during the admission process. Now, you do not need to meet or exceed the average GPA and GMAT scores of the school, but we would recommend that at least one measure, your GPA or your GMAT, exceed one of the two. Okay? If your GMAT score is below the average, it helps to have one above the average. Okay? And try to stay above the lower limits of the target school's middle 80% range. If you're below, the rest of your application materials must be stellar. So let me give you guys an example. Say the middle 80% of the school GMAT score for a school is 680 to 720. That means that 10% of the students score below a 680 and the other 10% score above the upper limit of 720. So if you score below a 680, then you have to make sure that your letters of reference, that your personal statement, and all other factors in your application are up to par and polished. Okay. For those of you who don't have the quote-unquote perfect formula, i.e. a high GPA and GMAT, this table can help determine what GMAT score you need to obtain if your GPA is under a certain level, and vice versa. In general, if your GPA is below a 3.0, the greater the likelihood you need to attain a 700 GMAT or above in order for your application to merit a favorable review. The higher your GPA, however, the less of a demand there is for a high GMAT score on your part. But keep in mind that these figures are subjective and will differ depending on the type of program and school you apply to. Okay. For those of you who score above a 3.5 or a 3.4, GMAT recommendations would be, above a 600 and whatnot. But all in all, I would say with, in my experience, scoring a GMAT score of 600 or above is something that admission committees would like to see. Okay. All in all, the proper formula for admission into an MBA program involves more than just GPA and GMAT and extracurriculars. It also requires students to have defined future career goals and personal intangibles that will lead them to successful and meaningful employment, which is the ultimate goal of many businesses and management schools, and the outcomes by which they are evaluated and ranked on. GPA and GMAT scores are important, most certainly, but they only play a part in the securing admissions. And remember, the admission process is a human process and therefore an inherently subjective one, although admission committees do strive to be as objective as possible. So make sure to establish a positive rapport with the admission committee pre and post application. Make sure to put your best foot forward and do as best as you can. Okay. At this point, I've finished a bit earlier than ahead of time, but I'm going to open it up to questions. Hopefully this has given you guys some indication of what admission committees are looking for in addition to just GMAT and GPA scores. Now, I do have a question here, and this is from Ravish. How does GPA for international students on a different scale match with US 4-point scale? Very good question, Eric. I'm sorry, Ravish. Admission committees tend to, some admission committees, some schools require their international students to reevaluate their transcripts using a third-party evaluation system, such as WES or another company that will translate their international transcripts to domestic base. Other schools, and I would say the majority of schools, actually don't require that, just because we understand that that is an added expense to international students. So what admission committees tend to do is they tend to seek faculty members who are experienced with transcripts, from international institutions, such as India or China. So what we tend to do is most transcripts will carry a grading system in the back of the transcript. So we're pretty good at balancing what a 90 out of 100 means, what an 80 out of 100 is, and so forth. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't worry too much, about the fact that your GPA is in an internationally scaled basis. Admission committees are pretty good at, converting them to US based and making sure you're, in par or evaluated in par with domestic students. Okay, but great question. Have another question here from Rashimi. Do the schools look for history of the GMAT exam taken by a candidate? Yes, we do. But for the most part, most admission committees do take the highest GMAT score. They do not average them. And in fact, if you've taken it more than once or twice, that is actually a positive sign, and it signals to the admission committee that you're doing the best you can and all you can to get admitted. So say your first score was a 580 and your second score was a 620 and your final third score was a 680. That is actually seen as a positive attribute on your behalf, on your part, to want to succeed and to be admitted with the most competitive score. So that's definitely a plus. Now, my recommendation to many of you would be not to take the GMAT score more than 3 times. Okay, statistically speaking, your score for the most part will not increase more than 20 or 30 points no matter how many times you take it. In fact, many students who take the GMAT score for a second time, or the GMAT exam for a second time, actually decrease points. So that kind of forces them or compels them to take it the third time. And by all means, do feel free to take it a third time if you feel the need to, but don't take it any more times beyond that. Okay, so that would be my tip of advice there. And besides, the GMAT exam is a bit expensive. It's about $250 the last time I checked, and this was 2 years ago, so I'm not sure if the price has gone up. So, you know, take it once, make sure you prepare for it. My recommendation would be to study at least, you know, an hour a day, once a day, for a full month, and that should prepare you enough to do well in the exam. Okay. Have another question here. Can you address how to build an alternate transcript if your GPA is low? Very good question. And I get this question a lot. Many students who have a low GPA, say a 2.0 or a 2.5, often elect to take courses at a community college or an extension program from an accredited university in order to demonstrate the admission committee that they are able to succeed in graduate courses. That is one option, and I would really recommend that for those students who do score below a 2.5 GPA. For those who score above a 2.5, that is one option as well. But I would recommend instead focusing my attention to doing good on GMAT and at least securing a 700, like this table here suggests. Okay. Another way to complement, you know, a low GPA is by taking certificate programs that may not necessarily actually add to your GPA or complement your GPA, but may signal quality or initiative overall. Okay. Another question from Roxanne. Here we go. Give me 1 second. How many years of work experience are recommended? At what point do you consider an executive MBA, and what are the differences? That is a very complex question. If you were to ask me that same question, say, 6 or 5 years ago, I would say that the recommended years of work experience would be 4 or 5, or even 6. But because we understand that the economy, you know, is down, and there aren't many jobs out there for our younger students, many business schools and management schools have actually lowered the recommended number of years of work experience required. All in all, I would recommend having at least 3 years of work experience before you apply to the program, or to our management program. It not only benefits you as it relates to, your chances of being admitted into the program, but it also benefits you in the sense that it will give you the time to really determine if, in fact, business school is something that you really want to pursue. And if it is, what type of field you want to go into, whether that be accounting, marketing, leadership, strategy, or global management. Okay? So we would always recommend our students to at least give themselves 3 years of work experience before applying to business schools. Okay? Second part of that question is, at what point do you consider an executive MBA, and what are the differences? Well, an executive MBA, for most programs out in the country, require you to at least have 5 years of work experience at the mid-level or executive level of an organization. And many of them require you to at least manage a certain number of people, or to have a certain number of subordinates. Here at the Drucker School of Management, we require for our students to at least have 4 years of work experience at the mid-level or at the executive level of their, respective companies, and to at least be able, to manage 10 or more individuals, and so forth. Okay, so that is the main difference between executive MBA programs and traditional 2-year MBA programs and whatnot. Okay, so if you find yourself already with those 5 years under your belt and you consider yourself to be a seasoned professional, then an executive MBA program might be a better option for you. And also keep in mind that the nature of the classroom is different between an MBA program and the executive MBA program. Executive MBA programs tend to be taught differently. The faculty member is not so much a lecturer and a professor. He's much more of a facilitator. And you'll be in classes with people who are also in your same positions. So the purpose of the classroom tends to be a bit different between executive MBA programs and traditional MBA programs. Okay. Another question here. How are the extracurricular activities that are not necessarily associated with an organization considered by the ADCOMs in general? For instance, helping peers at work improve their health. That is actually a good thing as well. You have to keep in mind that many students join different school clubs or different organizations because they want to satisfy or fulfill a personal interest or a personal cause that is dear to them. So say you're involved with something that involves public health or something that involves civil rights for a particular minority or underrepresented ethnicity. That definitely complements your desires or your goals to want to go to business school. We want to see what is the other side of our students other than just wanting an MBA and maybe going on to work for a lucrative business or nonprofit organization. So that's deemed as a very favorable and positive thing, and it will definitely add value to your application. Okay. Another question from Andy. If you have master's degrees, is the GPA of graduate education more important than undergraduate education? The answer is not necessarily. For the most part, many admission committees in many schools will actually just focus on your undergraduate GPA because it is that undergraduate GPA that will be calculated into the ranking of a school, okay? But that is not to say that your graduate GPA will not be taken into account. Like I mentioned earlier, graduate GPA plays also a role. It may play a secondary role, but it nonetheless adds value to the evaluation of your application. Okay, it gives us an insight as to how you've done in a graduate academic setting. Okay, so make sure to turn in all of your transcripts and all of the grades from all the schools you've attended. Okay. Another question from Joy. To enhance our profile, what type of nonprofit board should we try to join? Nonprofit board. I don't quite know if I understand that. Joy, can you clarify by what you mean with nonprofit board? In the meantime, I'll go ahead and answer another question. What's some advice on how to decide which MBA is more beneficial, 1 year or 2 year? Again, it all starts with your career goals, and it all starts with what goals you want to achieve in the short term and in the long term. If you're on the younger side and say you've only had 2 or 3 years of work experience, my recommendation would be to enroll in a 2-year program. That way, you will give yourself the opportunity to really take classes at a reasonable pace and really soak in everything, all the concepts you will be learning in the program. That would be my recommendation. For those of you who are working professionals or who are in a point in life where you might be transitioning from one career to another type of career, maybe a 1-year MBA program will actually be a better option for you, just because the opportunity or the luxury of being not in the working place is not really an option. So it really depends on your future career goals. It also depends on your financial situation. I know for many students, like I mentioned earlier, cannot really take a lot of time out of work for financial reasons. So in that regard, a 1-year program would be a better option. And it also depends on what you're actually trying to get your MBA for. Many students who enroll into a master's into a master's program often have the goal of pursuing a PhD later on. If that is the case, then my recommendation would be to enroll in a 2-year program. Not only will you do well or better because you're obviously, taking your time and doing the program at a more reasonable pace, but it will also allow you or give you the time to really synthesize everything you're learning, which will become very, very crucial once you start writing your dissertation in the years to come. Okay. We have another question here. On the note of taking additional classes to increase your GPA, is there a suggestion for how many courses or terms? Um, my recommendation would be to take, if we assume your GPA is low, say it's a 2.5 or a 2.0 GPA, and you've decided to matriculate into an extension program or take a few courses at a community college, my recommendation would be to take four to six classes, no more than that, and no less than that, actually. But the more important question is what type of courses you should take. And my recommendation would be to take courses that would be relevant or somehow complement the courses that you will be taking within the management program that you elect to enroll in. So for example, say you pursuing an MBA and you want to pursue a concentration in operation methods or in marketing. Do take 4 to 6 classes at another institution that deal with marketing or that deal with operations management. I would also recommend, taking 1 or 2 classes that are quantitative in nature. I would recommend taking a course in quantitative methods and statistics or in finance. And if you were to do well, I am pretty confident that admission committees will view that as a very, very favorable thing. So, don't be afraid to challenge yourself. If your GPA is low and you want to redeem yourself, do take courses at a community college or an extension program that are rigorous in nature, and that will definitely, make the admission committee review your application with more merit. Okay. All right. Another question. Do you recommend applying for a second MBA? Good question. It really depends. The rule of thumb is no. Many MBA schools tend not to admit students who already have an MBA. But for those of you who already have an MBA and want to go to a second MBA program, you have to clearly explain why. I actually received this question about 4 days ago, and the reason why this individual was pursuing a second MBA was because he felt he didn't get the skills or the training he needed to succeed in the organization that he was working for. So he felt that he needed to enroll in a second MBA with the hopes of obtaining such skills. If that is the case, make sure to write that and convey that in your personal statement or as an addendum to the admission committee. Because I will say most admission committees don't want to admit students who already have an MBA. They want to see that they're doing something with the MBA they already received, and if they haven't, they'll be really reluctant to admit such a person. Okay, so but again, if you have special circumstances or special reasons or particular reasons as to why you want a second MBA, make sure to convey that to the admission committee, either in the application or in a meeting before you submit your application. That way they have a heads up when your application does come through their desks. Okay. This is another question from Joy. Her clarification actually to her previous question. So let me go ahead and read that. I've heard from other seminars that if you don't have leadership experience in your resume, it would help to volunteer with a nonprofit and join a board to take on leadership role. Yes, in that regard, it is definitely a good thing to do. Now, personally, I don't know how many students can actually do that. In my experience working with nonprofits, their board requires them to donate tons of money or for them to have a collection or a trajectory of leadership experience before they can join the board. But if you find yourself in a situation where you'd actually join a board of nonprofit, I would definitely recommend it. And again, even if that means if it's a board or a nonprofit that is not necessarily lucrative in nature or business oriented, if it's a joining a board in a nonprofit that deals with public health or a board that deals with a museum or some other nonprofit organization, I would definitely recommend you joining that board and keeping tabs of all the achievements and accomplishments you've accomplished during your tenure in such board. Okay. Another question. What is the minimum base score of integrated reasoning scores seen by the colleges? You know what? Unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer for that. I know certain schools look at that, others do not, just because it has been recently integrated into the GMAT exam. So I would not know the answer to that, but I will definitely, for those of you who want to contact me later on after this presentation, I'll be more than happy to give you an idea, or at least an average, a national average. And I could get that from the GMAT website as well. And in fact, I believe the GMAT website actually conveys that as well. If you were to go to their analytical site, they could give you averages of what the minimum base score is and whatnot. Question. Is already managing people a necessary if planning to join an executive MBA program? Traditionally, the answer has been yes. We would want for you to have the 5 years of managing experience by the time you apply into the executive MBA program. But you know, that really depends on a case-by-case basis, you know, depending on the school that you apply to. Many schools are now seeing their executive MBA programs as a way or as a degree for those students who are going to transition from lower levels to that mid-level or executive level. So it really depends. You would have to ask the specific admission committees to see if, you know, managing people is a prerequisite instead of a requirement. Okay. Now, the next question is, do certifications such as CFA help with the MBA admissions? Yes. The CFA is actually a very, very good thing to have. The Chartered Financial Analyst Certificate, you know, signals to the admission committee that you could do finance and that you could deal with financial concepts and that you could, you know, handle some of the mathematical concepts that you'll be exposed to in quantitative courses. So the CFA certificate is definitely a plus. Even if it's just level 1 or level 2. Most of our applicants with 3 or 2 or 3 years of work experience have managed to at least pass level 1. So if you find yourself in that situation, definitely make sure to list that in your personal statement. And that goes for other types of certificates as well. I mean, if you have or are in the process of, you know, obtaining your CPA certificate or your certificate in financial advising or financial services, definitely make sure to add that to your personal statement or to your resume as well. Okay, the CFA does help. Next question, how big a role does a GMAT score play if one is applying for scholarships? It does play a big role. Now, you know, the admission process differs from school to school, but for the most part, the majority of schools tend to take a very holistic approach to the application when it comes to the admission decision. So they'll make sure to look at your work experience, they'll look at your GPA, your GMAT, they'll also take a letters of reference to make a decision of admission. Okay. When it comes to the scholarship or the financial aid decision, most schools tend to just focus on the GPA and the GMAT, because those two metrics tend to be the most objective metrics across, you know, the applicant pool. And scholarships and fellowships do tend to be awarded based on the merit of that year's applicant pool. Okay, so make sure, you know, your GPA and your GMAT are as high as possible if financial aid and scholarships and fellowships and what have you are an important thing for you. Okay. Next question, what is the importance or value of an essay score? Will a poor essay score hinder my chances? And I'm assuming this is a score on the GMAT. It might. What some admission committees do is they tend to couple your GMAT analytical score, which is the writing portion of the GMAT exam, with your personal statement and with your admission interview. So if, say, you've got a 1.0 or a 2.0 on the analytical portion of the GMAT exam, and your personal statement is not up to par, that will severely diminish your chances of being admitted. However, if you receive the low score, it is possible that your personal statement and the strength of your personal statement can offset that weak score on the analytical portion of the exam. Okay, especially more so if your admission interview goes well. Okay, but do try to score, to obtain as high of a score on the analytical. For the most part, most schools are looking for a score of 3.5 or above, and 3.5 is the lower limit. Most schools, I would say, would like to see a 4.0, okay, out of the 6.0 scale, I believe it is. Okay. Next question. Is TOEFL score a criterion for the admission for students from non-native English-speaking countries? Yes, and the TOEFL score is a big thing that we look at for international students. And that is coupled not necessarily with the personal statement, but with the admission interview. And that is another purpose of the admission interview for international students specifically. We're always trying to gauge your proficiency as it relates to English comprehension and English communication. Okay. For most schools, the minimum TOEFL is about an 80. Other schools, their minimum is about a 90. So make sure with your school and see what that minimum is. I know for certain schools, if you score below a certain level, you will be required to take some remedial classes. Here at the Drucker School of Management, for those students who score below 100 on the TOEFL IBT, they are required to actually enroll in the course that we call Global Communications. And it is meant to enhance the English proficiency of our international students. Okay, and our minimum is 80. Okay, now some schools do automatically deny students if they don't meet a certain level on the TOEFL IBT. For our school, is 80. For the most part, we do tend to deny all students who score below an 80 on the TOEFL IBT. That may be different for other schools. So again, make sure with the school that you're applying to. Okay. And in that same vein, make sure you do well on the interview. If you obtained a low score on the TOEFL, make sure you prepare diligently when it comes to the admission interview. Make sure you vetted your responses with friends or professional colleagues before you actually head into the interview. Okay. The TOEFL again is an important factor. Okay. I would say for international students, the TOEFL comes second after the GMAT and the GPA. Okay. Feel free to ask any other questions you guys may have. Oh, I just received another one. Does age play an important role in being admitted? No, not necessarily. Most schools do not discriminate admissions based on a few things, and that's sex, religion, gender and whatnot. And we also do not discriminate based on age at all. Okay. In fact, we actually, here at the Drucker School specifically, we appreciate students who have, or who are more seasoned professionals or who are older. We actually appreciate those students coming back to school and actually obtaining a GPA. So age does really not play a role at all when it comes to admission. What does play a role, like I mentioned earlier, is work experience. Now, for many students, age and work experience is correlated, meaning that the older you are, the more work experience you have. But that is not always the case, and the admission committee, will manage to discern that. Okay. Traditionally, we would like to see older students that are coming back for an MBA to have, work experience under the belt, and significant work experience that, matches their age. But again, that is not always the case. Okay. And that is also true going back to the executive MBA program. For the most part, executive MBA students tend to be on the older side. They tend to be around the ages of 40 to 55. Okay. The average age here at the Drucker School is about 42, last time I checked. Okay. But that doesn't mean that, if you're 35 or if you're 30, that you cannot enter an executive MBA program. It is possible that you may be 30 and actually be an executive of a company, or an executive for a small to medium-sized company. So don't let age be a factor in your decision to apply to an MBA program or an executive program overall. Okay. Next question is, do the admission committees place more weight on the overall GMAT score or the raw quantitative and verbal scores? We tend to place a lot more weight on the overall GMAT score because, again, that's what how most schools are actually evaluated on when it comes to rankings. So we will put a lot more emphasis on the overall GMAT score. Now, if your overall GMAT score is not as high as we would like it to be, we will then go, into your GMAT score and try to discern what went wrong, or whether the quantitative score is higher than the verbal and whatnot. Now, many students do ask, what's more important, the quantitative score or the verbal score or the analytical score? Well, I would say most admission committees would prefer to see a higher quantitative score than they would like to see a verbal score. So, if you only have time to study, more for one section than the other, do try to focus on studying more for the quantitative section, even though that may mean that your overall GMAT score might be low. Okay, so do focus on the quantitative section if you can. Will GMAT and TOEFL scores be waived if a student already has an MBA? No, not necessarily. For the most part, for most schools that are accredited by the AACSB or from a outside organization, most schools will require you to take the GMAT, even if you already have an MBA or a graduate degree in general in another discipline. Okay, for those students who already have an MBA and want to go into a PhD program at another institution, they too will also, for the most part, require you to take the GMAT. But for the most part, if you've taken the GMAT already once for your first MBA or for your first degree, chances are that your scores will be valid for when you apply to your second MBA or to a PhD program in management. Most schools require your GMAT scores to be no more older than 5 years, and most students tend to finish their programs within 2 years. Okay. So always take the GMAT, and I would always recommend taking the GMAT as a rule of thumb, because most students will not only just apply to one school, they'll apply to many, and for the most part, like I mentioned earlier, many schools will accept or require the GMAT. Okay, and it also helps when it comes again to fellowships and scholarships. Even if you were to submit a GMAT score to an institution that does not require the GMAT, it gives the admission committee a better sense of your potential to succeed in graduate school, and it will influence them to actually award you the financial aid or some sort of scholarships that they wouldn't otherwise if you had not submitted a GMAT. Okay. Next question: is 2 years of work experience considered very low for admission into most MBA programs? Well, nowadays it's not seen as a big negative. 2 years, in my personal experience, is a bit low. And I would probably say that's the case for most schools. They would see 2 years as too little time. But I would recommend applying nonetheless, and see what chances, what your chances are. I always tell students, don't tell yourself no, let us tell you no. So always apply. If you feel that you've had 2 years of meaningful and relevant work experience and you think you're ready, and you feel that an MBA now is appropriate in order for you to achieve your immediate goals, say 4 years from now, then definitely apply. Don't let work experience be a decisive factor. Like I mentioned earlier, we would like to see more work experience than not. Admission committees will like to have students to at least have 4, just because it correlates closely with you obtaining a job after you graduate. But you might be surprised. Okay, so my recommendation to you would be, go ahead and apply with 2 years if, in fact, you cannot wait an additional year. Okay. Next question. If you were involved with a school of your choice in the past, in minor, classes, or some other activities, will this contribute to the chance of getting admitted? Yes. Just make sure to demonstrate or to convey to the admission committee, the reasons for choosing such a minor, or for deciding to attend certain classes or being part of specific organizations. Let them know that the reasons you selected these schools or these organizations to work with was because there was a specific purpose in mind. Okay, they always, we tend to gauge maturity in that regard. You know, we want our students to have a focus. We want our students to be able to articulate specific goals. And we like for them to articulate how their past experiences will help them or, you know, achieve such goals in the future. Okay. How can an aspirant support, how can a future applicant, in other words, support their application when they have a significant break gap in their work experience? Very good question. I think this is the first time I've received such question. Let me think about this a minute. Well, traditionally, students who have a gap tend to be, you know, individuals who are on paternity or maternity leave, and that is a valid reason. Okay, so make sure if you know if that is in fact the case, make sure to state that in your personal statement or somewhere in your application, and that is a valid reason. That will not actually go against you. Okay, if you have a gap in work due to, you know, unemployment or because you were laid off from your previous company, that is a valid reason too. Okay. On the other side, do try to list the different activities or list the different things you did within that gap. Okay. We'd like to see that even though students may have had a gap in their work history, they at least were involved in something else, or they were at least trying to do something else, or, you know, in the process of finding future employment and whatnot. Okay. For the most part, nowadays, a gap in your work experience will not be looked upon negatively. We understand that the economy has not been great, at least here in the U.S., for the past couple of years. So that is much more forgivable than it has been in the past, both, you know, when it comes to applying to the MBA program and also when it comes to actually just applying to a regular job. Okay. But do try to show, you know, the different type of activities that you might have been engaged in during that gap. Okay. In your opinion, which is the more important, GMAT, GPA, or essays? As a person who interviews 5 people a day, as a person who reviews about 30 applications a week, if not more, I will say that the most important thing, at least to me personally, would be the essay and the admission interview. And I say that because, you know, and that's followed by the GPA and then the GMAT. And I say that because, you know, success in the GMAT does not necessarily correlate with your potential to succeed in graduate school. You know, I've had the experience where I've had students score a 720, 740, 760 in GMAT, and they turn out to be not the best of students, believe it or not. And I've had students, you know, we've admitted students with scores as low as 520 that have gotten 3.8s and 3.9s, you know, here at the Drucker School. So GMAT, to me, at least personally, is not too much of a factor. What matters to me is the student's ability to, you know, to convince me that they're ready for business school and that they're ready to immerse themselves in a academically rigorous program. What matters to me as well is, you know, knowing that they have a particular goal or a particular blueprint and plan in mind for their future. That gets me a lot more excited than a high GMAT or GPA, believe it or not. And, you know, nothing, you know, makes my day than actually reading a well-developed essay, a well-constructed essay that really conveys the students, you know, the reason for the students' passion and desires to actually attend an MBA program. So if I had to rank them, I would say for me personally, the admission interview plays the most important role, followed by the personal statements, okay, followed then by the GPA and GMAT, okay. And I dare say that is true for most people who are involved in admission committees. We really enjoy getting to know our students, whether that be on paper or through, you know, the interview. We'd like to see how the human side of our applicants, not just, you know, what's on paper, will contribute to our school, you know, as, you know, during their times as students and when they actually graduate as alumni. Okay. So once again, perfect formulas. Just to summarize, many students have the notion that a perfect formula is a high GPA and high GMAT. Well, like I've demonstrated, it's not necessarily the case. Because at the end, our goal as a business school, as a management school, is to have our students play successfully, to be employed successfully in meaningful work. And those students will actually obtain such work, are those who have a clear indication of what they want to do in the future, and who have a passion, a drive, to achieve such goals. And again, the admission committee can only discern that, by the admission interview, via the personal statement and the resume. So make sure, not to fall victim or fall trap to thinking that, a high GMAT and a high GPA will guarantee you admission. In many cases it might, and by all means do, make sure to study for the GMAT as much as you can. That, make sure you use all of the resources available to you. There's plenty of great resources out there. Beat the GMAT is one of them. To do well on the GMAT exam. But do know that admission committees are also looking at other things. Okay, for those of you who have a low GPA, many of you believe that your GMAT has to be really, really high. That may or may not be true depending on the school that you apply to. Okay, but the table that you're looking at right now, hopefully will help you, serve as some form of guidance. The rule of thumb is if you score below 3.0, it would be advisable for you to at least score a GMAT of 700 or higher. Okay, but again, I've seen students who have had a 2.5 GPA and be admitted with a 600 GMAT. Okay, so it's a very, the admission process is a very complex process, and that is the reason why we don't use fancy formulas or algorithms. And although I know some students out there believe admission committees do, especially the big, competitive schools, even they don't use fancy algorithms. So hopefully that has shed some light. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for all of you who are joining me this morning. Thank you very much for taking the time. Hopefully you guys have found this webinar informative and instructive. If you guys have any questions, about the Drucker School of Management or graduate education in general, or management education in general, by all means, feel free to contact me. You can always contact me via phone or email. My phone number is 909-607-9101. Again, that phone number is 909-607-9101. Or you could email me at albert.ramos, and that's spelled RAMOS, @cgu.edu. Again, that's albert.ramos@cgu.edu. And I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you guys may have, whether, again, that be, questions specific to the Drucker School or, management education in general. Admission committees, deem themselves as, professionals in education. So we're always happy to impart our knowledge and our experiences and our tips and advice over to you guys. Because at the end of the day, our goal is to see you guys succeed. Okay. Well, thank you very much, all of you, and hopefully we'll stay in touch. Take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.